Many moons ago, when I was a college student, my friend Paul borrowed a camper van from one of his relatives. It was a sweet ride, big enough to sleep 4 to 5 people. We suddenly had this great camper van, but no idea where to go. Paul and I reached out to our friend, Emily, and as a group, we decided to pick a destination for a road trip. Everyone was excited and full of ideas, some more realistic than others. We trusted Emily, who had a really good place in mind, and with that, our summer vacation plans were set. The road trip was on. Our plan was to drive toward a hot spring spa that Emily recommended. It seemed like a cool way to relax and forget about our studies for a while. The camper van made it even more fun because we didn't need to rely on hotels. We could eat, drink, and be at peace in the van, making it a cheap way to travel through Japan. For young university students like us, it was a real sense of freedom we hadn't experienced before. We drove further into the mountains, winding through scenic passes and lush green forests. The first night, we had so much fun that we ended up leaving really late, and on the second night, around 10 p.m., we needed to detox at those hot springs. The roads became more twisting and winding, and the streetlights were few and far between that far into the mountains. Paul was driving, and Emily was lying down in the back. Suddenly, the car's headlights illuminated 2 figures in the middle of the road, a parent and a child walking into traffic. It was a middle-aged woman holding a young boy's hand. We had to swerve around them, and although we weren't going very fast, it was still a close call. It was strange and unsettling. What were they doing out here in the middle of the night? Paul spoke up. "A kid that age walking on the roads out here? Huh? Yeah, that's true," I replied. "I guess they could live nearby, though. I haven't seen a house for a long while." "Have you?" Paul pointed out. He wasn't lying. We hadn't seen much of anything out there. The satellite navigation barely worked, and there were no landmarks or icons for restaurants and groceries. It was literally just a mountain, and we would be on it until we got off. There was no good reason for these people to be on this road at this time of night. "Where are you guys going?" I muttered. Paul looked over as we passed them, probably asking the same questions inside. It was odd, but we knew we'd be at the hot springs soon enough and could evaluate things then. Paul showed no signs of pulling over, so we continued on our way. When we arrived at the hot spring place, it had an RV park with a few cars and vans. But what struck us as odd was the commotion. People were clamoring and shining flashlights, frantically searching for something. As we pulled the camper van to a stop, 2 men ran towards us, explaining that a 2-year-old boy had gone missing. His parents had taken their eyes off him for just a split second, and in that short window of time, he vanished. Paul and I turned to each other, the same realization dawning on us. The middle-aged woman and the child we had just seen walking into traffic, they must be the ones. We got the distraught parents to look over the dashcam footage, and the mother confirmed that the little boy was her son. She begged us to take her to the spot where we had seen them, and we agreed. The parents jumped in the camper van, waking up Emily, who had no idea what was going on, and we headed back the way we came. Others from the parking lot followed in their cars. Driving down the winding roads, things weren't looking good. There was no sign of the boy or the abductor. When all hope seemed lost, my headlights fell on a small figure crouching by the guardrail at the side of the road. It was the missing boy. We hit the brakes and his parents ran to him. He wailed as his parents asked what happened. He said the woman had brought him there and told him to wait while she went through a gap in the bushes and trees. It was so stressful. Both parents and the child were crying tears of relief and fear. Soon, the police arrived and we went back to the spa. The police requested the dash cam footage, which we happily provided. They were treating the case as an attempted kidnapping. The police kept us updated on the case and eventually returned our dash cam memory stick. The woman who took the boy wasn't caught. They had no evidence, no motive, and no idea where she was going to take the child or where she came from. I often wonder about her motive. Perhaps she intended to abandon him or take him someplace. There was something so malicious about the situation. Thinking back, I'm glad I was suspicious when I first saw the woman and child. The image on the dash cam of her leading the boy away, smiling that disturbing smile, is one I'll never forget. My hometown is surrounded by mountains. I spent many happy years playing with my friends in those mountains, building bases, and playing hide and seek. The thing I enjoyed most was exploring. Those mountains felt as if they were ours. One afternoon, my friends and I had grown a little bored of the standard forest trails. We wanted more adventure, so we decided to go off the beaten path. A decision we didn't know at the time could have been life-altering or even life-ending. We wanted to walk where others hadn't, so we headed deeper into the mountainous woods. There were a few of us, and it was late summer. The trees provided a lot of shade, making it feel cooler than it was. Even as young as I was back then, I knew the risks, so I brought something along to help us not get lost. I had lifted a spindle of string from the art room at my school. I tied the end to a tree close to the forest trail so we could find our way back. It felt like a foolproof idea at the time. The ground off the trail was really uneven, littered with stones and dead tree limbs. We didn't mind because it made us feel like we were on an expedition, out in the elements, with nothing but the sounds of our labored breath and the distant trill of insects. It was amazing. After walking for about 10 to 15 minutes, we came across a small hill. We climbed it, and on the other side, it opened into a kind of clearing. I distinctly remember a big rock there. We figured this would be a great place to take a break and drink some water. One of my friends brought along some candy, so we were just tearing into that. While we were taking a break, I noticed something strange. I almost missed it, but once I spotted it, I had to take a closer look. It was a toy lying on the forest floor, a toy for kids younger than us. We were in the 4th grade at the time. Once I announced my discovery to my friends, they all came over to take a look, and our expedition turned into an investigation. It wasn't just one toy. There were others. Hot Wheels cars, a doll. Fear crept up on me seeing these objects in a place where they really shouldn't be. Frightened me. Maybe it was because, at my age, my toys meant the world to me, and I'd never leave them lying around, especially not in the forest. I was worried that something had happened. We all stood around puzzled, and then one of my friends yelled out to us. He was pointing at something a little outside of the clearing. We all raced over to look at what he was pointing at, and this is where things became difficult to explain. It was a kind of altar constructed of clay-like mud. It was the weirdest thing. It was definitely a human construction and didn't look natural. The altar had a hollowed-out section, and inside was an object. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but it looked like a photo. We had to find out what the photo was. It was dirty and looked as if it had been out there for a while. The photo was of a girl. It looked like a commemorative photo, like one you might see at a graveside. The photo looked as if it had been snatched right out of a cemetery. The forest around us, which had been the backdrop for our adventure, took on a different vibe. It seemed like we were somewhere we shouldn't be. It seemed as if all the calmness in our day had gone. I felt as if someone could be out there with us, watching us. All of a sudden, I didn't want to be off the beaten path anymore. There was something so illogical about what we were looking at. The toys, the photo, the weird mud construction. It was just wrong. I wanted to run, and a quick glance at my friends' faces told me they were on the same page. We followed the string back to the trail. We weren't in the mood to talk anymore, and I didn't feel like myself until I got out of those mountains. Since that day, I never played off the trail. I still have a general idea of how to get to the clearing where we found that weird altar, but I have no interest in returning. My mind tortures me with questions I can't answer. Why was that photo there in such a remote location? And the toys, were they some kind of grisly memento of something that happened to the girl in that photo? Were we looking at some felon's trophies? Another thought that comes to mind is that perhaps the family who lost that girl couldn't afford a burial. Through perhaps shame, they created their own memorial site in an isolated location where they could mourn without disturbance. If that's the case, it's heartbreaking. Nothing about what I saw that day all those years ago made sense, and this experience lives with me. When I was in elementary school, I often went to the countryside with my family. My extended family loved taking long nature walks, especially my dad's side, who were mountain climbing enthusiasts. This gave me plenty of opportunities to play outside with my cousins. One late summer evening, I was running around with my cousins, playing games on and off the mountain trail. I would run ahead, hide behind things, and then jump out to try to scare them. Although they were a little older than me and didn't scare easily, I was determined to surprise them at least once. I think they were happy to let me run ahead and hide so they could carry on with their high school conversations. Each time I ran ahead, I tried to make my hiding place more difficult to find. This turned out to be my downfall. I went too far off the mountain trail and got turned around. Before I knew it, I was deep in the dark woods with no idea how to find my way back. I must have mistaken a different trail for the main one and followed it deeper into the woods. As evening turned into night, I felt tears welling up in my eyes and realized I couldn't hold them back any longer. The realization that I was lost sank in, and I fell to the ground, sobbing. My young mind couldn't comprehend how hopeless the situation seemed. As the final rays of sunlight slipped behind the dark, towering mountains, night fell around the forest. I remember screaming my cousins' names, alone in the darkness, hoping someone would answer. My voice grew hoarse, and I put my hands together and began to pray. I was utterly terrified of what might happen to me out there in the wilderness. I stood with my back against a tree trunk, watching the night sky turn pitch black. I was hoping that, in a matter of seconds, a grown-up would find me. That's when I heard a voice call out, "Come here." I didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't one of my cousins. As I looked for the owner of that voice, I felt a strong tug on my wrist. Even though it was dark, I knew no one was around. It just didn't seem possible. The grip wasn't strong but warm, giving me a strange sense of security. Whatever was holding my wrist didn't make a sound, but I instinctively felt it was humanoid. I think I was talking, but I wasn't replying. I just remember feeling really safe. We started walking, not along the usual trails and paths, but through the trees and thick brush. The branches scratched me as we moved, but whoever was guiding me clearly knew the way. In what felt like a matter of minutes, I saw lights, the lights of houses. After a while, I recognized some familiar landmarks, like a billboard, and knew I wasn't far from my grandpa's house. The pressure on my wrist released as we stepped out of the forest. I turned back to look, now that we were in a lighter area, to say thank you, but whatever had pulled me out of the woods was gone. I stood there, staring at the darkness beyond the trees. I didn't want to be near that darkness anymore, so I kept moving, but then I stopped. I really wanted to thank whoever saved me and felt as if it was still around, just hiding in the dark. I stood there for a good 3 or 4 minutes, yelling thank you in all directions. Then I ran. I ran back to my grandpa's house. After the initial relief and joy of seeing me return home safely, my family began to question me. They were incredibly worried and had been scared they would never see me again, so they needed to know what happened. I told them, and they proceeded to make fun of me. My cousins were the worst, saying I made it up because they had never heard of a cryptid or monster from the mountains of Japan that helped lost people. But it did happen. I just don't know how else to explain it. I wish I could put into words the feeling I had in those moments, lost in the woods, but I cannot. All I can say is that I'm eternally grateful, there but for the grace of God. I have heard stories that end differently countless times. I could still be missing somewhere in that forest, and that thought really frightens me. When I was in 6th grade, I often went to the park after school to play. It was always fun, but one summer day, something weird and unforgettable happened. I saw a woman who looked just like me. She was an office worker, clearly a lot older than me, but nonetheless, all of my friends said she looked just like me. It was like she was the grown-up version of me. I remember that as soon as my friends laid eyes on her, they started shouting, "Hey, she looks like you." We were always noisy. That wasn't anything out of the ordinary. I guess we were a rowdy bunch back then. Usually, when we were being loud, any adults or teenagers passing by would either hush us or ignore us. But not this office worker who looked like me. She just stood there and stared at me and my friends. It was creepy. Once we had quieted down a little, we just kind of stared back at the office worker, stuck in a silent standoff. I started to get worried and didn't look away from her, but I think my friends felt the same as I did. I started to wonder if the person staring at us had some kind of sinister intentions. However, just as I was reaching the height of my concerns, the office worker stopped staring. I chose that moment to look back at my friends, just to see their expressions, and by the time I looked back at the office worker, she was gone. After she left, my friends and I slowly began to relax. We got to a point where we were able to joke about the situation. They made fun of me for having a creepy doppelganger. It was all fun and games that day, but when I thought about it later that night, there was something less funny and more disturbing about that experience. It was a weird day, one I thought about for a while afterward. Fast forward to when I was 22 years old, I had a strange dream. At that age, I was living in a city miles away from my hometown. In the dream, I was alone in the same park I used to play in as a kid. I felt very nostalgic to be back and somewhat lonely. I looked ahead into the park. It was a bright sunny day, and all the playground equipment looked nice and new, just like it did when I was a kid. I saw myself as a child playing in that park. I was with my friends, laughing as they pointed and screamed about someone who looked just like me. I just stood there like a statue, staring, unable to believe what I was seeing. I guess I wasn't aware that I was dreaming. Suddenly, I felt an intense desire to leave. I felt as if I didn't belong there. I just needed to go home. I felt a sense of fear, which I can only describe as being lost. It was a very strange emotion to experience. I just wanted to go home, so I turned to leave. That's the last thing I remember before waking up. I expected to wake up at home, but I didn't. I woke up in a hospital bed, with no idea how I got there. I was told that I had gotten into an accident on my way to work. I used to ride my motorbike to work. I have no idea who hit me, but I'm sure they never got into any trouble with the authorities. It was a hit and run. Turned out I had just come out of a coma. Apparently, I was walking the tightrope between life and death, and if my life had been a candle, it would have been flickering. A few days after regaining consciousness, I was finally discharged from the hospital. I left with worry in my heart and couldn't forget about the dream I had before I woke up. I saw what I saw when I was in 6th grade and then again in a dream at age 22. I found that the clothes I was wearing during my accident were business clothes under my leathers. I saw my future self that day when I was younger, and I am certain of that. I'm not sure why or how, but I know what I saw. Perhaps the reason I am still here, the reason I was able to wake up, was because of that interaction with what I thought at the time was a doppelganger. When I saw myself in the park as an adult and remembered the interaction, perhaps that was the trigger I needed to wake up from my coma dream. It was absolutely unexplainable, but I count each day as a blessing. Was that a glitch? Was I saved for some reason? Whatever it was, it is beyond my comprehension, but I am grateful. This happened when I was in the lower grades of elementary school. I was living in an apartment complex at the time, and I had my own bedroom, which was pretty big. I've always been a heavy sleeper and never usually woke up in the middle of the night, not even as a kid. When I was younger, I would only wake up if I was woken up. But that night was different. I woke up for some unknown reason, and when I tried to look at the clock, I realized that I couldn't move. Couldn't even open my eyes. It was my first and only experience with sleep paralysis. If you've never endured this horror, I'll try to explain it. It's a feeling of total immobility and the terror of not knowing why. I was lying on my back, confused and frightened, unable to open my eyes. I just felt incredibly strange. I felt something move at the foot of the bed and a weight almost climb onto the bed. The mattress depressed, and I felt the covers tighten. I wanted to pull my legs back, an instinctive reaction, but I couldn't move a muscle. There was a heavy object moving slowly up the bed, reaching my shins. I was fighting and fighting to move, but my body just refused. I didn't give up. I couldn't face lying there while something was advancing on me. Later in life, I got a dog, and the dog sometimes jumped up on the bed early in the mornings. Obviously, I was safe in the knowledge that there was a dog in the house, and the additional weight added to the bed was expected. But imagine feeling that in a pet-free home, while you can't even open your eyes to see the threat in front of you. So, I fought against the invisible bindings keeping me static in bed. Very, very gradually, I was able to slightly move. I slowly opened my eyes, like slats in blinds, and saw a pair of white ankles in front of me, standing on the bed. The person's legs were so pale and thin, they looked feminine. I thought for a brief hopeful moment that it was my mother, but I saw some white clothing fluttering. It was a thin kimono, something I had never seen my mother wear. She never wore anything of the sort. The woman was standing over me, bent over, her face inches away from my own, and leaning closer and closer towards me. Her kimono dropped around her ankles. I couldn't stand it anymore, so I shut my eyes again, and that was when I felt her black hair lightly caress my skin. I felt incredibly sick. My face was covered by her hair after a matter of seconds, and I could hear and feel her breath on my face. Even with my eyes shut, I knew there was a person right in front of my face. I was so scared and out of options. Since I had slowly regained some of my power, I decided to try and shout at the top of my lungs, "Go away!" I wanted to scream, but it came out breathy and quieter than expected. I wanted a lion's roar, but I got little more than a whisper. Internally, deep down in my heart, it was as loud as thunder. The next thing I knew, I was opening my eyes to the light of the morning. I looked all around the room and was relieved to find that I was alone. To this day, I am still terrified of the dark and being alone in the dark. I have also developed an unwanted habit. I wipe my face constantly, either with a handkerchief, my sleeve, or a face wipe. I cannot seem to forget the sensation of that hair against my cheek. I really hate it. This happened 4 years ago in March. I drive miles and miles for a living. I drive a truck. When you have a job like mine, you end up having favorite or least preferred areas for taking a nap or a rest, especially when you have a regular route. One of my favorite spots was beside this fairly big park. This park has roads surrounding it on all sides. All roads, other than the South Side Road, are pretty much redundant when it gets dark, making this a perfect place to pull into late at night. I think other truckers or long-distance drivers use this spot too. Sometimes I see a car or two when I pull in. Even in the daytime, it wasn't uncommon to see some people taking naps in their cars. The trees in the park create shade on each side, so it seems like a natural spot to relax. On the night my experience takes place, it's about 7 p.m., and I was taking an extended break. I pulled into the park area with the intention of taking a rest. That night, there were no other cars parked near there, just me. It was a quiet night. There was a clear sky, and the moon was out in full. I thought that I would nap for maybe 2 hours and then get back on the road again. I set the alarm on my phone to go off at 9 p.m., got comfortable, and shut my eyes. About an hour after I fell asleep, I suddenly woke up. This is one of the parts of my experience I have difficulty explaining. Rather than waking up, I found myself suddenly conscious. I cannot express that sensation properly, but that's the general idea. My eyes were still shut at this stage, but I was awake. The first thought that entered my conscious mind was, someone's watching me. Everyone knows that feeling, the feeling of being watched. It makes your skin crawl. I consider myself someone with no spiritual awareness. I lack the ability to sense the presence of ghosts. However, that night I felt something. I distinctly remember the feeling of eyes. Someone's glare from the driver's side window. I was feeling a bit worried. I'm not going to lie. I opened my eyes very slowly to see if anyone was out there or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. I planned on keeping my eyes half shut so that I would still appear to be asleep. But when I saw what I saw, I could not force my eyes from growing wide with shock. What I saw outside of my window was my own face, expressionless, staring back at me. The person on the other side of the glass looked identical to me, save for just one facial feature. The me outside the window didn't have a nose. In other words, I was looking at a mirror image of my own face, but it lacked a nose. I think it must be quite hard to visualize, but there was just nothing where the nose should be. The me thing was staring at me inquisitively through that window, as if I was some animal in an exhibition. It felt like there was no one but us here in the dark, isolated park by the road. I was so shocked by this that I literally jumped out of my seat and shouted. My sudden reaction seemed to freak out the me thing, and it turned and ran off into the night. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest that I felt as if it was about to burst. What the hell was that thing? Was it some kind of extraterrestrial, some yokai, some kind of cryptid? Why was it trying to imitate my face? Or did I simply hallucinate the whole thing? I was not under the influence since I was working that night. I don't know if it was down to me being half asleep and my nightmares bleeding into reality, but this was the most horrifying experience that I have ever had. When I woke up in the middle of this thing's transformation, I must have prevented it from completely copying my identity. Well, this is my theory anyway. I know I must sound crazy, but I am constantly asking myself questions like, is there some kind of me out there in a half-finished state? After this experience, I have become terrified of sleeping in my truck. I have had scary dreams before, and I can say with my hand on my heart that this was nothing like a dream. This was real. I think that thing hides in secluded places, waiting for victims like me for whatever reason. I am unsure, but it gives me the chills when I think about it. If anyone knows anything about some sort of entity that copies or mimics people's appearances, then I would like to know. It all started during my morning commute on the train. I got into the rhythm of getting on the same train, the one that departs at a specific time, not the same actual train. In addition to that, I usually boarded the same carriage through the same door. You know what I mean, right? If you have ever commuted by train, you quickly figure out which is the best spot to board. I don't know if you've seen the trains in Tokyo, but they get incredibly crowded during rush hour. I almost always ended up standing in front of a passenger, and when they got off, I was able to get a seat. It was just a routine for me. One morning, I came to the realization that I almost always stood next to the same man on my morning commute. I noticed he usually stood to my left. Once, I looked over and saw that his smartphone was in camera mode, on selfie mode, and aimed at me. Like most people, I found that pretty creepy. I thought it would be best to switch carriages before things got worse. I really didn't want any issues. I just wanted to get to work. It was a good plan in principle, but after a few days, I saw the same guy right at my shoulder again during the crowded commute. He was standing there gawking at me, giving me a full-on stare. I could do little more than just smile when our eyes met, but having to do that made me feel incredibly sick inside. I didn't want to cause a scene or give him some sort of victory over me. I got off as usual with no further incidents, but I left the train feeling more than a little freaked out. I sensed something ominous on the horizon, a premonition. I thought about it at work, knowing the problem wasn't going away. I could change carriages as much as I liked, but I still had to get on that train to get to work. The situation seemed unavoidable. About a month rolled around, and by then, I'd gotten pretty skillful at picking different carriages each morning. I managed to avoid that strange man and began to relax a little. I wasn't as tense or clenched up each morning. I even slept a little easier at night. But one morning, something happened that made my blood run cold. I was outside my office building about to go in when I suddenly felt an urge to turn around and check my surroundings. Maybe it was that feeling of being watched. I spun around and saw the creep from the train staring right at me. He stood there, glaring at me, as still as a statue amongst the hordes of passing pedestrians. Despite Tokyo's bustling streets, it felt like he and I were the only two people on Earth. Time stood still in that moment for me. He then approached me, and I couldn't believe his audacity. He said, "Hey, I've been checking you out ever since you got on the same train as me. I'm always looking for you each morning. You know? I guess I kind of fell in love with you. Can you believe that? So, listen, do you work here?" I screamed, "No," and ran for it. That morning, I called the office and told them I would be late. I hated doing that because I was supposed to deliver a presentation, and it didn't go down well with my boss. Eventually, a position came up for transfer, and I went for it and got it. Could have been worse, but it was traumatic enough for me. If you want more stories like this, please subscribe to my YouTube channel to be updated in my latest uploads. Thank you for watching.